On a freezing morning in November 1988, a spacecraft that looked almost exactly like America's space shuttle lifted off from a launch pad in Kazakhstan. It circled the Earth twice. Then it came home and landed itself on a runway in a 50-mile-an-hour crosswind with no pilot at the controls and not a single human being on board. It was flawless. It was, in some ways, more advanced than the American machine it resembled. And it never flew again. Not once. 14 years later, that same spacecraft was crushed to scrap when the roof of the shed it was parked in fell on top of it, killing 8 men. Here's what makes this story genuinely strange, though. The Soviet Union didn't build this thing because it wanted a space shuttle. Soviet engineers had studied the American design carefully and concluded it made no economic sense at all. They built a copy anyway, and the reason why is one of the most expensive misunderstandings of the entire Cold War. They didn't copy the space shuttle because they thought it was brilliant. They copied it because they couldn't work out what it was for. When NASA announced the space shuttle in the 1970s, the pitch was economics. Rockets were throwaway machines. You burned millions of dollars of hardware on every launch. A reusable winged spacecraft would fly to orbit, land like an airplane, and go up again. Space travel would become routine and cheap. In Moscow, the Soviets did what any rival would do. They ran the numbers themselves, and their analysts kept arriving at an uncomfortable answer. It didn't add up. Refurbishing a shuttle between flights would be enormously expensive. The Soviet Union simply didn't launch enough payloads to justify a fleet. By their own calculations, the Americans would lose money on this. Publicly, Soviet officials said exactly that, dismissing the shuttle as a waste of money. But privately, that conclusion created a much darker problem. Because the Americans were not fools, and they were pouring a fortune into this machine anyway. If the world's best engineers were building something that made no economic sense, then the Soviets had to assume the real purpose was one they hadn't been told about. The question became, what is it actually for? The Soviet military supplied an answer, and it was terrifying. Look at the shuttle through paranoid eyes. It has an enormous cargo bay, big enough for something other than satellites. It can change its orbit. It comes down out of the sky whenever it chooses, landing on an ordinary runway. And crucially, it could pass directly over Soviet territory. So the fear took shape. What if this was a space bomber? A vehicle that could carry nuclear weapons into orbit, wait there, then dive on Moscow with almost no warning. Others worried it could reach out and snatch Soviet satellites out of orbit and carry them home to be dissected. None of that was true. The shuttle was never used that way. But the fear was real enough to move a superpower. The order came down: build one of our own. Not because the Soviet space program needed a shuttle, because if the Americans had one, the USSR could not afford to be without an answer. The Soviet Union spent tens of billions on a spacecraft it didn't want to counter a weapon that didn't exist. And that left its engineers with a bizarre assignment. Photographs of the two vehicles side by side look like the same machine in different paint. And to be fair to the Soviet engineers, some of that is unavoidable physics. Anything gliding back from orbit and landing on a runway ends up with broadly similar wings and a similar heat-shielded belly. But underneath, they made one decision that was genuinely smarter than the original. On the American shuttle, the main engines are bolted into the orbiter itself. That means the rocket cannot fly without the shuttle attached. The Soviets moved the engines onto the rocket instead. The result was Energia, a colossal launcher that could hoist the shuttle to orbit or, on its own, lift enormous payloads with no shuttle at all. Where NASA had built one machine locked into one job, the Soviets had built a system that could be split in two. More than 1,000 enterprises across the Soviet Union were pulled into the project. Construction started in 1980. The first full-size orbiter rolled out in 1984. They named it Buran, Russian for snowstorm. Ordered to copy a machine they didn't believe in, Soviet engineers quietly fixed the flaw the Americans had built in. And then they went one step further, a step NASA never dared take. On the 15th of November, 1988, Buran launched from Baikonur. There was no crew. There was no life support system installed. The entire mission, launch, orbit, re-entry, approach, landing, was to be flown by the machine itself. It orbited the Earth twice. Then it dropped back through the atmosphere and lined up on a runway in weather that would make a human pilot sweat, touching down in a crosswind of around 60 kilometers an hour and rolling to a stop 206 minutes after leaving the ground. Of its roughly 38,000 heat shield tiles, it lost 8. That runway, incidentally, had been built to obsessive standards. The story goes that the chief designer drove a car along it with a glass of water balanced on the bonnet, checking for bumps. Not a drop spilled. Understand what had just happened. Every American shuttle landing, from the first to the last, was flown manually by an astronaut. The Soviet copy did on its very first flight the one thing the original never did in 30 years. It landed itself, perfectly, with nobody on board. It was the program's greatest triumph. It was also the last time Buran ever left the ground. The following summer, Buran was flown to the Paris Air Show on the back of the world's largest aeroplane, a trophy paraded in front of the West. A second, longer flight was planned. There was talk of missions lasting weeks. None of it happened. The program had consumed something like 20 billion rubles, and the country paying for it was collapsing. The Soviet economy was in freefall, and a spacecraft built to counter an imaginary space bomber was impossible to justify. Launches were postponed, then postponed again. In 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and in June 1993, President Boris Yeltsin formally terminated the program. And by then, the whole reason for its existence had quietly evaporated. The American shuttle had never carried a nuclear weapon, never snatched a satellite, never behaved like the bomber Soviet planners had imagined. Buran was built to answer a threat that had never been real, and it was canceled before anyone had to admit it. The machine itself was rolled into an assembly building at Baikonur and largely forgotten. What happened next is the part that still stings. For 9 years, the only Soviet spacecraft ever to fly in orbit sat in a poorly maintained hangar parked on top of a mock-up of the rocket that had launched it. On the 12th of May, 2002, workers were carrying out repairs on that hangar's roof when the structure gave way. The roof came down. 8 workers were killed, and Buran was crushed beneath the rubble, the flown orbiter, and with it, the physical proof of everything the program had achieved. Its sisters didn't fare much better. One nearly finished orbiter still sits gathering dust in a building at Baikonur. Another was abandoned in a car park in Moscow. A test vehicle ended up in a German museum, which is now the best preserved of them all. The only spacecraft to beat NASA at its own game wasn't destroyed by a failure in flight. It was killed by a leaking roof nobody had bothered to fix. So that's Buran, a machine of genuine brilliance, built for reasons of fear rather than need, flown once to prove a point, then left to rot until the building fell on it. And here's the lesson underneath the whole story. The Soviets didn't copy the space shuttle because they'd studied it and found it good. They copied it because they couldn't read their enemy's mind. And when you can't understand why your rival is building something, the safest assumption is always the most frightening one. Fear is the most expensive engineer in the world. There's a final irony in it too. Analysts have since pointed out that the Soviet Union spent a fortune duplicating a program America itself later judged to be flawed. Two superpowers, the same enormously costly machine, one built out of optimism, the other out of terror. Buran flew perfectly, exactly once, and answered a question nobody had actually asked. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.